Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a bird, perfectly built for soaring through the air, navigating the surface of the water, and then just disappearing.
Gone, right under the surface.
Not just dipping its head, but truly diving deep, hunting in a world completely alien to most winged creatures. It's an incredible feat.
It really is a highly specialized skill, and it demands a whole suite of unique physiological and behavioral adaptations,
Must.
moving seamlessly between air, surface, and then this dense, pressurized underwater environment. It's a rare and demanding way of life in the avian world.
And that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. We're plunging into the fascinating and perhaps unexpectedly vulnerable life of diving birds.
Using that stack of research and articles you sent us.
Yeah, focusing on the red-throated diver, a master of this underwater hunt. And the challenges it faces today, especially from, well, human activities in its marine habitat.
That's right. We have a collection of sources here. There's a broad study looking at extinction risk across different waterbird groups. A detailed report from a scientific workshop discussing how human marine industries, particularly offshore wind farms, can displace these birds.
Right, displacement. We'll get into that.
And some really insightful modern research that uses pretty cutting-edge methods to figure out exactly what red-throated divers are eating.
So our mission today is to pull out the essential insights, the surprising facts maybe, and the critical takeaways from all this material.
Yeah, we want to understand the amazing biology that makes diving possible.
Why this very specialization might carry unique risks.
And how our expanding presence in the ocean could be impacting these incredible specialists.
We're trying to connect the dots, aren't we? From like the mechanics of a single dive and the contents of a meal.
All the way to the energetic costs of avoiding something like a wind farm and how that might ultimately affect the bird's survival and, well, the health of its population.
Okay, let's start with just how unusual diving is for a bird. Because when you think of water birds, you might picture ducks dabbling or herons wading, right?
Sure, the common stuff.
But deep diving for prey, that feels like something else entirely.
It really is. When you look at the global picture, there are over 700 recognized species of water birds.
Wow, that many.
Yeah. But according to one study we have here, fewer than a third of those species actually dive fully underwater to find their food.
Less than a third.
Much less. The vast majority feed on the surface or along the shore, dabbling, wading, picking things off the top.
So if a bird does dive for food, it's not just a casual behavior. It's like a core part of its identity and biology.
Absolutely. Species that have taken up diving are highly specialized for it. They've evolved particular body shapes, maybe different bone densities, specific foot or wing structures.
And physiological abilities too, right? For breath holding, pressure.
Exactly. Managing breath holding and pressure changes. It's a significant evolutionary commitment. It's not something they just decide to do.
And what's truly remarkable, according to the research, is that this diving ability didn't just evolve once and then spread out.
No, that's one of the most striking findings. The ability to dive for food appears to have evolved independently multiple times across the bird family tree.
Multiple times?
The study estimates it originated at least 14 separate times in different lineages of birds that started from non-diving ancestors.
Wow, 14 different times. It's like different groups of birds, totally unconnected, all arrived at the same brilliant but difficult solution for accessing food.
It really emphasizes the evolutionary challenge, but also the reward of underwater foraging.
Yeah, there must be something good down there.
It suggests the food resources available underwater are significant enough to drive such complex adaptations repeatedly. And these independent evolutionary paths seem to correlate with how they dive.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, there's a clear relationship noted between a diving bird's size and its main method of propulsion underwater.
Okay.
Larger diving species, think about loons or cormorants, maybe even penguins. They tend to use powerful strokes of their feet or wings to actively swim and pursue prey underwater.
So they're actively propelling themselves through the water, like little feathered submarines.
Exactly. They push themselves through the water column, actively swimming down.
Right.
On the other hand, smaller diving species are more often plunge divers. Think of a gannet, or maybe a kingfisher, hitting the water from high up.
With that incredible speed and force.
Yes. Their momentum takes them into the water to catch fish, often near the surface.
So larger birds swim down, smaller birds tend to drop down from the air.
That's the general pattern observed. And interestingly, the research indicates that these three main methods, using feet for propulsion, using wings, and plunge diving, also evolved independently from each other.
So not only did diving itself evolve multiple times, but the ways of diving did too.
Precisely. Different physical forms led to different diving techniques, each emerging separately in different groups. It wasn't a single invention, but multiple parallel inventions of diving.
That's fascinating. And how does our red-throated diver fit into this? Which method do they use?
The red-throated diver uses that pursuit diving tactic we mentioned earlier. They swim along the surface, often with their head partially submerged, kind of peering below.
Scanning for prey.
Exactly, looking below to scan for prey. Once they spot something, they execute a rapid dive, propelling themselves underwater, primarily using their feet to chase down the fish.
So they're in the larger foot-propelled pursuit category.
Correct.
Seeing them disappear below the surface is always impressive. But knowing the deep evolutionary history and the physical demands of that act, it makes it even more remarkable.
It does. And this incredible specialized skill, this key to their success in finding food, leads to a really surprising and, well, counterintuitive finding discussed in the research.
Okay, what's that?
The study on extinction risk found that these highly specialized diving birds are actually at a greater risk of global extinction compared to water birds that don't dive.
Wait, really? That seems completely backward. The thing that makes them unique and lets them access a whole different food supply also makes them more vulnerable.
It seems that way, doesn't it? But it's about the double-edged sword of specialization.
How so?
Consider the example the sources use. Penguins. They are the absolute epitome of diving specialists. Incredibly streamlined, powerful swimmers, built almost like torpedoes.
Right, the masters of the marine world.
Yes, underwater. But that extreme specialization for the water comes at a cost in other environments. Their body shape makes them awkward and slow on land.
Famously so.
And crucially, they've lost the ability to fly. So if their specific marine habitat or primary food source disappears or is drastically altered, say, by climate change affecting prey distribution or by human activity making an area unsuitable.
They can't just pick up and fly somewhere else or start eating something different on land.
Exactly. They have very limited flexibility to switch to a different environment or a different type of food.
Unlike, say, a gull, which can plunge dive for fish but also happily scavenge on the beach or in a field.
Or famously, steal your lunch.
Right. They'll eat anything.
Exactly. Gulls are generalists in their feeding habits and are much more adaptable. The study notes that the gull group is actually increasing in diversity.
While the specialist divers are potentially more at risk.
That's the finding. The diving specialists like the red-throated diver face a different challenge. The research suggests that once the diving adaptation evolves, it appears to be, well, irreversible.
Irreversible, meaning they can't just decide, okay, diving is too hard now, I'll go back to wading or surface feeding.
Precisely. Their physiology, their body structure, it's so fundamentally adapted for the underwater world that they can't easily revert to being surface feeders or shift to land-based food sources if their marine prey declines. They are highly invested, locked into the marine environment.
So while diving gives them access to a food niche others can't reach, that very specialization ties them tightly to the health of that specific marine ecosystem.
Exactly.
And if conditions change rapidly or drastically, that adaptation, while incredible, could potentially represent an evolutionary dead end because they lack the flexibility to adapt their feeding strategy or habitat.
That's the concerning idea raised by the research. Their greatest strength becomes their potential Achilles heel in a rapidly changing world.
And one of the most significant drivers of rapid change in the marine environment today is, unfortunately, human activity.
Which brings us to the increasing presence of things like offshore wind farms. These are vital for renewable energy, of course, but they're being built right in the areas where these potentially vulnerable diving specialists live and hunt.
Right into their preferred habitats.
They are. And the workshop report you provided goes into detail about the consequences of this. The primary impact discussed is displacement.
What exactly does displacement mean in this context? Is it just them moving away?
It's basically the consequence of the disturbance caused by anthropogenic marine structures created by humans. That includes the physical presence of the turbines themselves, yes.
The big towers.
But also the noise, the vibration, and the visual disturbance during both construction and operation, and the frequent movement of vessels and personnel around the site.
So it's not just a static object, it's an active, potentially noisy and busy industrial area out in the water?
Right, and the result of all this disturbance is that birds actively avoid the areas around these structures. They steer clear.
Okay.
This leads to reduced densities of birds near wind farms. effectively shrinking the available habitat for them.
Okay.
An area that was once perhaps used for foraging or resting is now largely avoided, becoming unusable habitat in practice.
And there's also something called the barrier effect. That sounds related.
Yes, avoidance doesn't just mean they lose the area inside the wind farm boundary. If the wind farm is located on a regular flight path between different important areas, say a feeding ground and a resting site.
Their daily commute, maybe?
Exactly. The birds have to fly around it. This forces them to change their local flight patterns, their distribution, and their abundance in the area.
So it's like putting a big obstacle course right in the middle of their daily routine or their migration route.
That's a good analogy. It creates a barrier they must navigate, often at a significant energetic cost, which we'll come back to.
Okay.
And the report notes that the scale and degree of displacement aren't uniform. It's not the same everywhere or for every bird. It varies considerably depending on several factors.
Like where the wind farm is actually located, that must matter hugely.
Exactly. How close it is to crucial habitats like known feeding grounds, migration corridors, or molting areas. Also, how large the wind farm is, the density of turbines.
And maybe whether there are good alternative places for the birds to go.
That's critical. Whether there are suitable alternative areas nearby that aren't already packed or are less productive. If there's nowhere else good to go, the impact is worse.
And the impact must also depend on when the birds are using the area, right? Seasonally.
Crucially so. The number of birds present and their sensitivity changes depending on the season. Are they staging during migration? Are they wintering? Is it near the breeding season? The time of day matters, and also their life stage. A bird needing to put on fat for migration might be more impacted by losing a feeding area than one just resting.
Right, different needs at different times.
All of these factors interact to influence the overall effect on a given group of birds.
So the location, the size, the alternatives available, and the timing all determine how severe the displacement is. Let's bring it back specifically to our focal species, the red-throated diver. What do we know about the specific marine environment they prefer and how they use it?
Well, the sources, particularly the workshop report and that diet study, paint a pretty clear picture of their winter habitat preferences. Red-throated divers are known to favor near-shore, sandy, shallow marine waters.
Shallow and sandy.
Typically found in depths between about 5 and 30 meters, occasionally down to maybe 42 meters. The research around the UK, even mentioning breeding season preferences, really points to sandy substrates, often less than 20 meters deep.
Okay, so shallow and sandy seems to be a really strong preference. What does that preference tell us about how they might be hunting?
It strongly suggests they are feeding on or very close to the seabed in these areas. One source even speculates, this is quite interesting, that their slightly upturned beak might be an adaptation specifically for probing into or disturbing that sandy substrate.
Like digging around for things hidden in the sand.
Exactly. Searching for hidden prey down there. It's a possibility implied by their consistent use of this habitat type.
That's a fascinating detail, a beak potentially adapted for sand digging underwater.
It fits the pattern. The sources also highlight their active exploitation of specific hydrographic features, like estuarine fronts. They mention these fronts in places like the German Bight and the Thames estuary as key examples.
Estuarine fronts. What's happening there that attracts them? What are those exactly?
So estuarine fronts are basically where different water masses meet, often, where fresh water flowing out from rivers mixes with the salt water from the sea. These boundaries can create predictable areas where prey, particularly small fish, become concentrated.
How does that work? Currents? Salinity?
Yeah, due to currents, salinity gradients, maybe changes in turbidity, it just physically concentrates the food. The sources suggest these fronts make foraging easier and more predictable for the divers, less searching needed.
So they're targeting these sweet spots where food is reliably easier to find. Smart.
Seems like it. Nature's version of a well-stocked pantry. And this behavior of using fronts for concentrated prey isn't just in Europe. It's observed in red-throated divers in different parts of the world, like Western North America. So it seems to be an important foraging strategy for the species.
Okay, but you said defining their habitat can be difficult, so they don't only use these areas.
That's right. The sources also acknowledge that while shallow, sandy areas and fronts are noted preferences, they are also observed over deeper water, sometimes greater than 20 meters, even without obvious fronts. And they've been seen feeding in fast-moving currents in coastal channels too.
So while they have clear preferences, they're also adaptable enough to use a range of marine conditions depending on where and when they are. It's not rigidly fixed.
Exactly. Their winter habitat use seems quite broad, making precise definition tricky.
Okay. And how much of their day is spent actually hunting in these areas? Do we know?
Well, the exact proportion of time red-throated divers spend foraging in winter isn't precisely known. But the workshop report gives us a useful clue by mentioning data from a closely related species, the great northern diver.
Okay, what about them?
Great northern divers can spend up to 70% of their daylight hours foraging.
70%. 70. That's an enormous commitment of time and energy devoted solely to finding food.
It is. It really highlights how demanding foraging is. And the sources point out the implications for birds wintering at very high latitudes, where daylight hours are extremely limited during winter.
Right, short days up north.
If red-throated divers don't forage at night, and there's no evidence in the sources to suggest they do, unlike some other seabirds like petrels,
They'd have to be incredibly efficient hunters during those short periods of light.
they would need to be highly efficient to acquire enough energy. Every minute counts.
So whether it's probing shallow sands, exploiting a productive front, or navigating fast currents, every moment of hunting needs to be productive, especially on a short winter day. This brings us to the next key piece. What exactly are they catching when they're down there? What's on the menu?
Ah, yes. This is where the modern science comes in, and it's pretty insightful. One study from the German Bight used a relatively new technique to analyze the diet of overwintering red-throated divers. DNA metabarcoding of fecal samples.
Okay, DNA metabarcoding. So instead of the old way, like looking for tiny fish bones or scales in a bird's stomach?
Which often came from dead birds. Bycatch, for instance.
Right. Instead, they're analyzing DNA found in the bird's droppings.
That's the core idea. It's much less invasive, obviously. You can sample live birds, and this DNA-based method can potentially identify a much wider range of prey species.
Even things that get digested really quickly.
Exactly. Fish that are very quickly or thoroughly digested might leave little or no morphological evidence, no bones or otoliths, but the DNA can still be detected for a while.
So walk us through it briefly. They collect bird poop,
Fresh samples, ideally,
extract DNA.
focusing on specific genetic markers, often mitochondrial DNA, that are common to prey animals but vary enough between species to allow identification.
And then match it against known species databases.
Basically, yes. They use specific primers to amplify the DNA from different potential prey groups like fish, crustaceans, cephalopods. They add unique tags to each sample so they know which dropping is which.
Keeping track.
Then they use high-throughput sequencing to read millions of these DNA fragments. And sophisticated bioinformatics tools compare these sequences against comprehensive reference databases of known species DNA.
And that tells them which prey species were present in the bird's recent meals.
Exactly. The sources do add a note of caution, though. While it's powerful for identifying what was eaten, interpreting the quantity of each prey item based on the proportion of DNA sequences found is still tricky.
Why is that?
Because DNA from different species can amplify differently in the lab process or persist for different lengths of time in the gut. So it's great for presence-absence and frequency of detection, how often a prey type shows up, but less precise for estimating the exact biomass or percentage contribution of each prey consumed.
Got it. It's like knowing all the ingredients that went into a meal, but maybe not the exact measurements in the recipe.
That's a good way to put it. Still very powerful for understanding the breadth of the diet.
And this study was focused on the German Bight.
Yes, which is highlighted as an internationally significant area for red-throated divers. It acts as a major staging ground, hosting something like 20% of the entire NW European wintering population.
20%.
Particularly concentrated there in the spring before they head north to their breeding sites. So this is a really key area.
Understanding what they eat there is crucial for a big chunk of the population then. So what did the DNA reveal about their diet in the German Bight?
The main finding was that they exhibit a broad prey spectrum. The study identified DNA from 19 different fish taxa belonging to 13 different families.
19 different types of fish. That certainly seems to reinforce the idea that they are not specialists in terms of what fish they eat, but rather opportunistic generalists within that underwater hunting niche.
It really does. The study identified 5 dominant groups that made up the bulk of their diet detections. Clupids, which includes small, schooling fish like herring and sprat.
Okay.
Mackerel. Gadoids, which is the codfish family. Flatfish like dab. And sand lances, those small, slender fish often found buried in sand.
And which was most common?
Of those, clupids, the herring and sprat family, were detected most frequently across all the samples.
Can you give us a few specific examples of fish species they found?
Sure. Within the clupeids, they found Atlantic herring, European sprat, and also European pilchard or sardine. The mackerel detected was Atlantic mackerel. For flatfish, they identified DNA from the right-eye flounders family generally, and specifically common dab.
Common dab, right.
The gaddoids included the family overall, plus specific species like European pollock, haddock, whiting, and Atlantic cod. And for sand lances, they found greater sand eel and other species in the Amidites genus.
That's quite the varied menu. Small schooling fish near the surface, bottom dwellers like flatfish, sand eels in the sand, even potentially larger predatory fish like cod and pollock.
Yes, it suggests they are taking whatever is locally abundant and energetically valuable in those sandy nearshore areas, or perhaps concentrated at those fronts we talked about.
Makes sense.
The study also noted that this broad diet composition was surprisingly consistent between the two sampling years for most major groups. Clupeids, mackerel, flatfish, gaddoids were all pretty stable in frequency.
But there was some variation.
Yes, one significant variation. Sand lances were detected much more frequently in samples from 2015 compared to 2016.
Ah, interesting. So that variation for sand lances could just reflect annual differences in the abundance or maybe the distribution of those specific prey fish in the German Bight area.
That's the likely interpretation. It suggests the divers are quite flexible and are responding to the local availability of different prey sources year to year. If sand lance numbers are down, they've switched to something else that's more available.
Opportunistic.
Exactly. And another really notable finding from this DNA analysis was the almost complete absence of certain potential prey types.
You mean things that aren't fish, like shellfish or crabs?
Precisely. Despite using primers specifically designed to detect DNA from cephalopods, like squid and octopus, and crustaceans, like crabs or shrimp, they were virtually undetected in this study.
Really? Nothing.
Almost nothing. This strongly supports previous findings from older morphological studies, the ones looking at stomach contents, that suggested these groups are not important components of the red-throated diver's diet, at least in this region.
So even though older studies occasionally found tiny bits of crab or something?
Yeah, they speculated even then that those might have been secondary prey, meaning they were already in the stomachs of the fish the divers ate, rather than being targeted prey themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. So despite living in a marine environment teeming with diverse life, their diet seems almost exclusively focused on fish.
It certainly looks that way from this evidence.
So they are specialized divers, but generalist fish eaters within that diving niche.
That summarizes it very well, I think. They have the specialized tool set of diving, and they apply it opportunistically to a broad range of fish species found in specific habitat types like those shallow sandy areas and fronts.
Okay, now let's try and connect this dietary need in eating lots of different kinds of fish, possibly up to 630 grams a day, and their habitat preferences back to the impact of human activity and that displacement issue.
Right.
It seems like being pushed out of a productive feeding area or having to constantly fly around a large wind farm could have pretty significant consequences for a bird that needs to hunt so much, especially if daylight is limited.
It certainly can. And the sources highlight that red-throated divers seem particularly sensitive here. They show a strong behavioral stress response to anthropogenic disturbance.
Stronger than other birds.
They are described as highly sensitive. They react strongly to shipping traffic, for instance, and show a more pronounced avoidance reaction to marine structures like wind farms compared to some other seabird species that have been studied.
And what's their reaction? Just fly away?
Yeah, their immediate reaction when disturbed is often to stop whatever they're doing, feeding or resting, and fly away. Increase their distance from the disturbance.
So putting a wind farm or having a lot of boat traffic right in a prime red-throated diver feeding or resting area is very likely to cause them to simply abandon that spot, at least temporarily.
That's the behavioral response observed, and that's what leads to displacement.
Hmm.
And the workshop report raises a really thought-provoking idea related to this.
Oh.
That this strong stress response to marine disturbance might actually be non-adaptive in the context of modern human activity.
Non-adaptive. How could being sensitive to disturbance not be helpful for survival?
Well, think about where they breed. On land, near freshwater locks. Being highly sensitive to disturbances at their nest sites on land is definitely adaptive. Divers are vulnerable on land. Their legs are set far back. They're clumsy.
Right.
So flushing easily from the nest if a potential predator approaches helps protect their own survival, allowing them to breed again.
Hmm.
But in the open marine environment, being extremely wary of large, static, non-predatory structures like wind turbines or predictable vessel traffic.
It might cost them more than it gains them.
That's the idea. It costs them energy, they stop feeding, they fly away with no apparent benefit in terms of avoiding a real threat. Perhaps they just haven't evolved to differentiate these novel, large-scale disturbances from genuine predatory threats in the marine realm.
So the cost of responding to our structures and activities might be higher than any potential gain from avoiding them because they aren't actually dangerous in the same way a predator is.
That's the hypothesis put forward. And these costs are primarily energetic.
Okay, let's break down those energy costs.
First, simply moving away from the structure, the act of flying itself, requires significant energy expenditure. And flight is particularly energetically demanding for birds with high wing loading ratios, like divers.
High wing loading, you mentioned that before. Can you explain that simply? What does that mean for the bird?
Sure. Think of an airplane's wings. A glider has huge wings relative to its body weight that's low wing loading, allowing for efficient soaring. A fighter jet has small wings for its weight, high wing loading, needing lots of power for fast flight. Divers have relatively small wings compared to their body mass. Their bodies are streamlined for diving, dense even, not primarily built for effortless soaring flight like, say, an albatross.
So they have high wing loading.
Yes, which means flight is energetically costly for them. They have to work harder to stay airborne compared to birds with larger wing areas relative to their weight.
Okay, so just flying away from a disturbance costs them more energy than it would for, say, a gull or a gannet with lower wing loading.
Exactly. The cost per unit of distance flown is higher, and that energy expenditure is amplified by the barrier effect we discussed.
Right, having to fly around things.
Yes. If a wind farm forces them to detour from their direct path between a resting site and a feeding area, that's extra flying distance. The report gives a specific estimate for this.
Yeah.
They calculate that deviating just 15,000 meters, that's 15 kilometers, or about 9 miles to get around a wind farm, could expend an extra 42 kilojoules of energy for a red-throated diver.
42 kiloj just for one detour. And if they have to do that repeatedly, day after day, or if there are multiple wind farms creating complex, longer routes.
The cumulative cost adds up rapidly. That extra flying not only burns precious energy, but also eats into valuable foraging time, time which, as we said, might already be limited, especially in winter at high latitudes.
And are there other energy drains associated with this?
Potentially, yes. The sources mention they might expend energy actively avoiding being pushed towards structures by strong currents or wind, or maybe increased vigilance, spending more time looking around, being wary if they are staging or resting near disturbed areas, burning energy they would otherwise conserve while resting.
It really sounds like displacement is putting a significant strain on their daily energy budget. We talked about how much fish they might need to eat, that 630-gram figure. Do we have a sense of their overall energy needs beyond just food intake?
The workshop report provides an estimate for their daily energy expenditure, acknowledging it's likely a maximal value for wintering birds outside the demanding breeding season. Based on assumptions about their basal metabolic rate, BMR, their field metabolic rate, FMR, how efficiently they assimilate energy from food, and the average energy density of fish. They estimate a red-throated diver might need to expend energy equivalent to consuming up to approximately 630 grams of fish per day during winter.
So that figure is maybe closer to their total daily energy need, not just the food weight?
Yes, it reflects the total energy budget needed to cover all activities and maintenance, though they do caution it might be biased high compared to actual non-breeding needs. And of course, fish energy density varies a lot, but it gives a sense of scale.
Over half a kilogram of fish worth of energy every single day just to survive the winter. That requires a lot of successful dives and efficient hunting.
It absolutely does, and it highlights a bit of a paradox raised by the sources.
The paradox.
Despite the high energetic cost of flight due to their high wing loading, tracking studies show that red-throated divers are often observed to be highly mobile during winter. They fly between different areas frequently, covering significant distances.
Huh. If flying is so expensive for them, why move around so much? Wouldn't they be better off staying put if they find a decent spot?
You'd think so, perhaps. But there must be a significant advantage in terms of energy acquisition associated with that mobility. It must pay off.
Ow.
They're likely constantly sampling the environment, searching for those patchy, temporary concentrations of prey we talked about, or tracking dynamic features like those estuarine fronts where prey might be predictably concentrated for a time.
So the benefit of finding a really rich feeding ground by being mobile outweighs the high energetic cost of flying to find it.
That seems to be the most logical explanation. Their mobility is likely key to meeting that significant daily food requirement, especially if prey distribution is patchy or unpredictable over time.
Okay, so this combination of high energy needs, physiologically expensive flight, and yet observed mobility really sets the stage for understanding how displacement might affect individuals differently depending on their personal strategy.
Absolutely. And the tracking studies discussed in the sources show there's actually a lot of individual variation in winter movement patterns.
Oh. Not all red-throated divers behave the same way.
Not at all. Some tracked individuals are highly mobile, covering large distances and constantly shifting between different areas throughout the winter, while others are much more sedentary, staying within specific, more limited locations for extended periods.
So you have the travelers and the homebodies, basically.
In a manner speaking, yes. And a key question raised in the sources is, are both of these strategies equally successful in terms of getting enough food and maintaining condition?
Right. Are the highly mobile birds constantly searching because they're struggling to find enough food in one place? Or are they actually the successful ones, efficiently exploiting multiple shifting patches of prey across a wide area?
And conversely, are the sedentary birds doing well because they found a particularly reliable, productive spot? Or are they perhaps stuck in a less than ideal area?
It's hard to know just from the movement pattern alone.
Exactly. It's something that needs more research to understand the underlying reasons and consequences of these different strategies. What we do know, however, is that individuals, regardless of their mobility pattern within a winter, do show a tendency for site fidelity between winters.
Site fidelity, meaning they come back to the same general areas year after year.
Yes, they tend to return to use similar staging areas, molting sites, and wintering zones year after year. Though, again, there's large individual variation in which specific site they choose to be faithful to.
So my red-throated diver might come back to this bay off the coast of Scotland every winter, while yours goes to that estuary in the Netherlands, but they tend to stick to their chosen spot year after year.
Precisely. And this site fidelity is really important when thinking about displacement impacts.
How so?
Well, a highly site-faithful bird, whose traditional wintering area now have a significant disturbance like a new wind farm, might be more negatively affected than a highly mobile individual who is perhaps already familiar with many alternative locations across a broader range.
Because the faithful bird is losing its known preferred spot and might not know where else is good.
Exactly. Even if suitable prey is theoretically available in a new, undisturbed area somewhere else, the site-faithful bird might struggle to forage efficiently there due to a lack of detailed knowledge about the best hunting spots, the currents, the prey behavior in that unfamiliar environment.
It's not just about food being present, it's about knowing how and where to get it effectively in that specific location. Local knowledge matters.
Yes, local knowledge and experience likely play a big role in foraging success. The sources also highlight potentially important differences based on age.
Young birds versus adults.
Yes. Juveniles, first-year birds, tend to be more mobile and generally winter further south than adults.
Further south.
Yes, ringing studies support this. Birds ringed as chicks in places like Iceland or Scotland are later recovered wintering as far south as the Bay of Biscay, France, or even Spain. Whereas adults tend to stay closer to their breeding areas, maybe wintering around the UK, North Sea, or Baltic.
So are the young birds doing a sort of exploratory tour during their first winter?
That's a strong possibility. They might be sampling different regions and habitats during their first winter or two before settling on a more consistent wintering location when they become adults.
And how does this relate to displacement?
Well, juveniles also have lower survival rates than adults. Some research suggests this lower survival might be linked to a learning period where they are simply less efficient foragers. They're still figuring things out.
Makes sense.
Whether that learning curve is site-specific or more general is unknown, but it means displacement could potentially have a disproportionately severe impact on these younger, less experienced birds if they get pushed out of areas where they are just starting to learn how to forage successfully.
It could be much harder for them to cope than for an experienced adult.
Potentially, yes. They have less experience, maybe lower body reserves to start with. It could be a tougher challenge.
Okay, so age matters. Are there any known differences based on sex? Do males and females winter differently?
There's some speculation about sex segregation in wintering areas, which is seen in a few other seabird species. Some samples of red-throated divers captured, for example, off the U.S. Atlantic coast and in the German Bight have shown a female bias.
More females caught.
Yes. And there are speculative ideas mentioned, like maybe Males favor areas closer to the eastern Baltic breeding grounds, while females might winter further east or south. But the sources are careful to caution that clear evidence for widespread sex segregation in red-throated divers is currently lacking.
So it's more tentative.
Very tentative. The observed biases in captured samples could be influenced by the capture methods used or the specific location sampled, rather than reflecting a true large-scale segregation. Interestingly, bycatch samples in fishing gear, birds accidentally caught, which are often thought to overrepresent birds in poor condition or young birds, showed no sex bias but were dominated by immatures.
So less certainty on sex differences, but clearer patterns related to age and individual movement strategies like mobility and site fidelity. And what about birds coming from different breeding populations? Does that matter?
It might. The sources point out that birds that breed at very high latitudes, like in the Arctic, naturally spend a longer period on their wintering grounds.
Why is that?
Because ice conditions delay their return to the breeding areas in the spring. They have to wait longer for the thaw. This means they could potentially be exposed to the effects of displacement from marine industries on the wintering grounds for a longer portion of the year compared to birds breeding further south.
More time spent in potentially disturbed areas.
Exactly. Though the sources note it's not certain whether this necessarily makes the consequences more severe overall. It depends on the specific area, the level of disturbance, and how they respond during that extended period.
Okay, so it seems like the impact of displacement isn't a simple uniform thing. It's a complex picture that varies depending on the individual bird's age, its movement strategy, its site fidelity, perhaps where it breeds.
Absolutely. All of these factors interact.
Yeah.
And ultimately, all of these factors and the energetic consequences of displacement influence the bird's body condition.
Which, as you said earlier, is fundamental. It links directly to its survival and its ability to breed successfully later on.
Yes, the sources really emphasize this direct link. An individual bird's energetic budget, that balance between the energy it acquires from food and the energy it expends on all its activities like flying, diving, thermoregulation, avoiding disturbance, that budget directly determines its body condition.
And body condition, in turn,
is a critical determinant of key demographic rates, like survival probability and breeding success.
a bird in good condition is simply more likely to survive the winter and reproduce in the summer.
Precisely. However, measuring body condition accurately in wild birds is challenging. The sources acknowledge the difficulties and potential biases in the data we can get.
Especially if samples come from things like bycatch, birds caught in nets.
Right. Those samples might disproportionately include birds that were already in poorer condition, or perhaps younger, less experienced birds that are more susceptible to being caught. So they might not represent the average condition of the population.
And you mentioned fat stores earlier.
Yes, they mentioned that red-throated divers have substantial subcutaneous fat stores, a bit like blubber in marine mammals. But they suggest this might function more for insulation and buoyancy in the cold water, rather than being the primary energy reserve that fluctuates rapidly with condition, like fat scores used in some other bird studies. Other internal fat stores might be more indicative of their readiness for high energy demands like migration.
So you can't just judge their condition by how fat they appear externally. It's more complex.
Not necessarily, according to the research discussed. But there is evidence in some bird species, and it's assumed to apply here too, that there's a minimum body condition threshold. A certain level of energy reserves is necessary before they can successfully undertake really energetically demanding activities.
Like migration or breeding.
Exactly. Like long-distance migration back to the breeding grounds, or initiating courtship and egg-laying.
This is where that concept of carryover effects becomes really significant, right? What happens in winter doesn't just stay in winter.
This is absolutely crucial, is the idea that the conditions and experiences a bird faces in one season can significantly impact its performance and success in a later season, even months later, and in a different location.
So how does that work with displacement?
Well, if displacement leads to reduced energy intake, maybe because they're avoiding good feeding areas or spending less time foraging, or it leads to increased energy expenditure from all that extra flying around barriers.
Their energy budget gets squeezed.
Right. This could lead to them ending the winter period in poor body condition. They've used up reserves or haven't been able to build them up sufficiently.
And if their condition is poorer when spring arrives?
If they don't reach that necessary minimum condition threshold, it can have major negative carryover effects into the breeding season, even though that breeding might take place hundreds or thousands of miles away from the winter disturbance.
What kind of negative effects are we talking about?
The potential consequences can be quite severe. A bird in poor condition might simply not have enough energy reserves to even undertake the demanding migration north to the breeding grounds.
So they just wouldn't attempt to breed that year.
Or they might attempt it but arrive late at the breeding grounds, which often reduces success. If they do manage to breed, they might lay fewer eggs or lay them later in the season. Late breeding is often linked to reduced hatching success, higher rates of chick predation because predators are more active, or lower survival rates for the chicks after they fledge because they have less time to grow before autumn sets in.
Wow. So disturbance in the wintering areas, like the North Sea,
Can translate directly into reduced numbers of chicks successfully fledged on Arctic or Scottish lochs months later, or even complete breeding failure for that individual that year.
our footprint in the ocean during their winter can directly impact the next generation being produced far away.
That's the core concern with carryover effects. And the sources place this within the context of the typical seabird life history strategy.
What's that strategy?
Seabirds, especially long-lived ones like divers, generally prioritize high adult survival over the success of any single breeding attempt. Their evolutionary strategy is to ensure they survive to breed again in future years.
Play the long game.
Exactly. Maintaining their own body condition is usually paramount. This is also why juveniles, with their lower survival rates anyway, often show poorer body condition than experienced adults. They are still learning to be efficient foragers and are perhaps more vulnerable to environmental challenges. The adults prioritize themselves.
So, if conditions get tough, an adult might skip breeding one year to ensure it survives to breed the next.
That's often the case for long-lived species. However, the workshop report does offer a potential counterpoint, or at least a mitigating factor.
Oh.
They suggest that if red-throated divers are generally in relatively good condition during winter, maybe they aren't normally pushing their energetic limits, perhaps only needing to forage for a smaller proportion of the day than, say, that 70% figure seen in great northern divers.
If they have some slack in their budget.
Exactly. If they have some energetic buffer, they might have the capacity to absorb those additional energetic costs imposed by displacement and barrier effects without their condition dropping below that critical threshold for migration or breeding.
So, if they're not operating right at their energetic ceiling anyway, maybe the extra cost of avoiding a wind farm isn't necessarily devastating for every bird's future breeding prospects.
That's a possibility raised in the report. It offers a glimmer of potential resilience. But critically, they emphasize that without better data on their actual energy budgets throughout the year, how much time they really spend foraging in different wintering areas, and what those critical body condition thresholds actually are for red-throated divers.
It's hard to know if they truly have that energetic buffer or not.
Exactly. It remains a key uncertainty. We don't know how close to the edge they're typically operating.
Which leads us, I suppose, to the biggest and perhaps most uncertain question of all. How do all these individual effects, the stress, the displacement, the energy costs, the potential impacts on condition and carryover effects, how do they translate into potential impacts on the overall population size and growth rate?
Right. That's the ultimate question for conservation and management. The conceptual pathway is clear, as laid out in the sources.
Can you walk us through that pathway again?
Sure. Disturbance from human activity leads to a behavioral response, primarily displacement, and barrier effects. This behavioral response leads to changes in individual energy budgets, usually higher energy costs from extra flight and avoidance, and potentially reduced energy intake.
Okay.
These changes in energy budgets can result in poorer body condition, especially by the end of winter. Poor body condition then directly impacts individual demographic rates, things like annual survival probability and breeding success due to those carryover effects.
Right.
But, and this is the crucial step for this chain of events to cause a population level change, a sufficient number of individuals across the population need to be impacted significantly enough to alter the overall population dynamics. That means affecting the average birth rate or death rate enough to change the overall population growth rate and ultimately the size of the population.
And it sounds like the evidence to definitively link those individual effects we can observe or infer to those broader population changes is still, well, developing.
It is. The sources, particularly the workshop report, strongly emphasize that drawing concrete conclusions about population-level impacts is very difficult without more robust empirical evidence. Evidence that specifically links the observed effects on individuals, the displacement distances, the calculated altered energy budgets, the measured changes in condition to documented changes in survival rates, breeding success rates, and ultimately population trends for the species.
That direct connection is the missing piece.
It's often the hardest piece of the puzzle to get. We can model it, we can infer it, but getting direct observational proof across the whole population cycle is extremely challenging for mobile marine species like this. So there's still significant uncertainty.
So while we understand the mechanism of how displacement could negatively impact the population, we don't yet have definitive proof that it is happening at a scale that is causing, say, a significant decline in the total red-throated diver population size across Europe.
Precisely. The report highlights this gap and identifies key areas where future research is urgently needed to try and bridge it.
Such as?
For example, better understanding the fine-scale spatial distribution patterns of the divers within wintering areas. Are they randomly spread out, or do they actively avoid each other, which might suggest interference competition could become an issue if densities increase?
Okay. How they use space. What else?
And evaluating and quantifying the total amount of suitable wintering habitat available across Europe. This is critical.
Why is knowing the total amount of habitat so important?
Because if we know exactly how much good habitat there is, we can better estimate how many individuals might be displaced by new developments planned in those areas. And then we can calculate the resulting increase in bird density in the remaining suitable locations.
And would that increased density likely lead to problems, like more competition for food?
Interestingly, the sources suggest that for red-throated divers, direct density-dependent competition for food might not be the main problem if displaced birds crowd into alternative sites.
Oh.
Because they generally occur at relatively low densities anyway, even in good areas. They're quite spread out compared to some seabird colonies. The assessment is that the impact on their body condition resulting from the increased energetic costs of having to fly further to get there, plus the potential reduced foraging efficiency in an unfamiliar area, is likely more significant for this species than birds directly competing for the same fish because the area became too crowded.
So the cost is more about the individual's energy budget, stress, and adaptability challenges in a new place, rather than about literally running out of fish because there are suddenly too many divers packed into one bay.
That's the assessment based on the current understanding presented in these sources. The individual energetic and behavioral consequences seem paramount.
Okay, this has been a really deep dive into a fascinating and complex world. Let's just take a moment to quickly recap the main points of our journey today.
Sounds good. We started by establishing just how rare and specialized diving is among birds overall, and that surprising counterintuitive finding that this very adaptation might actually put them at a higher risk of extinction than their non-diving relatives due to that lack of flexibility.
Right, the specialization trap.
Right.
Then we zoomed in on the red-throated diver specifically. We talked about their pursuit diving method, their preference for those specific shallow, sandy, nearshore habitats, and also productive estuarine fronts where prey concentrates.
And we explored the really cool insights gained from that cutting-edge DNA metabarcoding study, revealing their surprisingly broad, almost exclusively fish-focused diet in key areas like the German Bight, taking things like herring, sprat, codfish, flatfish, sand eels.
Then we shifted to the impacts of human activities, particularly marine industries like offshore wind farms. We defined displacement, how disturbance from the structures, noise, and vessels causes these sensitive birds to avoid vital areas, and the related barrier effect forcing them to fly around these obstacles.
And we dug into the potential consequences of that displacement, the increased energetic costs, especially given their high wing loading making flight expensive, costs from extra flying, avoiding structures, maybe increased vigilance, and the flip side, potentially reduced foraging time or efficiency.
All of which can negatively impact their body condition, that crucial link between energy balance and fitness.
Exactly. Which led us to discuss the critical concept of carryover effects, how poor condition accumulated during the winter, potentially exacerbated by displacement, can jeopardize their ability to migrate successfully and breed productively months later, far away.
And we touched on the complexity added by individual variation, how factors like a bird's age, its movement strategy, mobile versus sedentary, and its faithfulness to specific wintering sites might influence how severely it's affected by disturbance.
Finally, we acknowledge the significant uncertainty that still remains in confidently translating these observed or predicted effects on individuals into concrete predictions about overall population level changes, stressing that need for more targeted research to fill those crucial knowledge gaps, particularly linking individual impacts to population dynamics.
So what does this all mean when you put it together? We've seen how a remarkable specialist adaptation, the ability to hunt underwater while making a species incredibly successful in its niche, can also inherently limit its flexibility when that niche changes rapidly.
A potential vulnerability emerges from its strength.
And we've seen how our expanding human footprint on the ocean, even through structures like wind farms intended for environmental benefit in other ways, can create significant challenges for sensitive species like the red-throated diver. Challenges that could potentially ripple through their lives, impacting their energy reserves, their ability to reproduce, and ultimately, perhaps, their future.
It really underscores the complex interplay between a species' evolved biology, its specific environmental needs, and the increasing pressures from widespread human development in those environments.
So, thinking about all this, given the red-throated diver's known sensitivity, their deep reliance on specific marine habitats, and the fact that key areas like the German Bight are demonstrably vital staging grounds for a large portion of the entire European population, what responsibilities does that place on us when we plan and develop marine industries in these areas?
It's a huge consideration.
How do we balance our essential need for things like renewable energy and using marine space with the equally essential need to protect vulnerable specialists who have evolved over millennia to thrive in those very spaces? How do we ensure coexistence is possible when our presence on and under the waves continues to grow so rapidly?
That's the critical question, isn't it?
Hmm.
It highlights the immense challenge for marine spatial planning, for environmental assessment, and for conservation efforts globally. We need to ensure we're effectively applying the knowledge gained from research like the studies we've discussed today to make truly informed decisions. Decisions that carefully consider the full potential impact on these remarkable, highly specialized, and potentially vulnerable species.